So we've been talking up to this point about mobile, and now I want to kind of reprieve something that I was talking about a little earlier, which is this idea of going from mobile to screens. So the most important concept here is the fact that there's lots of screens. It's not just mobile versus desktop anymore. We've got mobile devices of varying sizes, tablets, we have desktops, we have TVs as well. But there are going to be more and more, from refrigerators to small embedded devices with small screens. There are going to be more and more different ways that people consume information from the interwebs. And it's going to be important over time to think about what is your strategy for supporting those. And it's interesting that the use cases are really quite distinct between each one, because for mobile devices, typically it's ad hoc. It's not just on the go, as we talked about, but it's these ad hoc microtasking, whether you're bored, whether you need local information, or whether it's just a second screen, an easy way to check a calendar or reviews for a restaurant, even though you might be within access of a desktop device. Then when you start thinking about tablets, tablets are really about lean back. They're about saying, rather than sitting forward and consuming information through a laptop, it's kind of leaning back and focusing on how can you just kind of browse and interact with content. It's why Flipbook is perhaps the prototypical tablet application, where you can just kind of flip through information from your friends, perhaps respond to something, but it's kind of casually reading a magazine. Then we've got the desktop experience, which is very much about lean forward, substantive effort. I'm working here. I've got a laptop, I've got a desktop, I'm trying to get stuff done. And then the kind of entertain me experience of being in front of a TV with a large screen, perhaps with a group of people, where you want here you've got the biggest screen real estate, but again, you actually want to almost go back to mobile-like simplicity in your design. You want to have a way that people can engage with content in a group setting, perhaps using remote controls or using tools that make it you just need to make it very easy for them to navigate content and access the entertainment that they want to share, either with themselves or with other people. So it's important to, when you start thinking about mobile, to have some kind of way of thinking about screens as well, and understand that it's an important part of your strategy is to decide what is your tablet strategy, what is your large screen TV strategy. How are you going to think about the kind of content you want to share and the kind of use cases, and make sure that you can do it in a way that's appropriate for all of these different growing numbers of screens over time. So in the last section, what I'd like to do is just take a little bit of time to give some kind of high-level heuristics or hints and tips about picking a strategy in three main areas: website versus app, and then if you're building a website, mobile first or custom site, and for applications, what's the best way to go about building them. So let's look at each one of those one at a time. The first thing is web or app. There are huge marketing benefits to having an application. It's something that's potentially on people's home screen, so it's really easy for them to access. Now, to be fair, if you've got a website, you can encourage people to bookmark it, which will then create a link on their home page. But I don't see that strategy being wildly successful yet. I see more and more people asking you to bookmark, but still most people don't do it. So if you really want to get the marketing benefits of being in an app store, of being right on somebody's homepage, it does make sense to build an app. But it's important to understand just how big a commitment it is when you move from a website to a web application. For example, when I'm building a website, if I make a change to the website, it changes. So anyone else who goes to see that website will see exactly the same change. If, however, I build a web app, here's what happens. Typically, there'll be two components to a web app. There'll be the piece that actually goes onto the phone, but then there's going to be some kind of server standing behind that, which, assuming, if you just created maybe a simple Sudoku app that did nothing but allow somebody to go through a limited number of existing Sudoku, there might be no issue. But typically, your website, your app will also have to go back to a server to get information about restaurant reviews or whatever it is that your application is involved with. And because of that, once you've got the complexity of having once you've got this complexity of an app, there are a couple of issues. The first is the app itself is more difficult to create. And every time you want to make changes, you need to get that approved and reviewed, so it takes longer to make changes to your application, so it's a slower learning cycle. But secondly, you also now have the complexity that you can't force everyone to upgrade, which means at any given point in time, there might be 4 or 5 or even 6 versions of your app out there. Now, given that they all need to speak to the same server, sometimes they're going to have different requirements. And so that might mean you might need to have multiple versions of the server software so that it will provide multiple APIs that your application can respond to so that you're supporting the different versions of your app. So realize that when you move into the business of developing apps, it's fundamentally more complex and more expensive. So if you can get away with just building a website, do so. Only build an app if you really need to.